Thanksgiving was always a big deal in our family. Mom had this thing about tradition: turkey roasted to perfection, cranberry sauce, homemade, never canned, and the kids' table for the younger cousins, even though most of us were in our 20s now. It was our first big family gathering since Grandma passed away last spring, so the vibe was heavier than usual. That's when it started. We were halfway through dinner when Mom said, "Everyone, I'd like to introduce someone special." She motioned toward a man I hadn't noticed before, sitting at the far end of the table. His presence felt off. His hair was slicked back, and his smile was too wide, like he was trying to fit in but didn't know how. "This is Alex," Mom said. "Your uncle." "Uncle?" I thought. Grandma had 3 kids, Mom, Aunt Linda, and Uncle Joe, and that was it. The family tree was solid. I glanced at Linda and Joe. They looked as surprised as I felt. "Nice to meet everyone," Alex said, raising his wine glass. "I've heard so much about this family." The silence was deafening. Mom quickly pivoted the conversation back to safer topics, but I couldn't stop staring at Alex. Who the hell was he? After dinner, when everyone was lounging around, I cornered Mom in the kitchen. "What's the deal with Alex?" I asked. "I thought Grandma only had 3 kids." Mom hesitated, glancing toward the living room where Alex was laughing with Aunt Linda. "She did. But, before your grandma married Grandpa, she had a child. She gave him up for adoption." My stomach dropped. Grandma was always so open about everything. How could she have kept something like this a secret? "Alex found me after Grandma passed," Mom continued. "He's family." I didn't know what to say. Shouldn't this have been a group discussion? Something we all decided together? Over the next few weeks, Alex became a fixture in our lives. He showed up at Aunt Linda's house to help her with her garden, played golf with Uncle Joe, and even invited himself to my sister Sarah's birthday party. Something about him still didn't sit right with me. He always seemed too eager, too polished. And he knew things, details about Grandma's life that even I didn't know. One night, I was helping Mom clean out some of Grandma's old stuff when I found a box labeled Alex. Inside were letters, photographs, and hospital records. Grandma had written to Alex over the years, apologizing for giving him up. But there was one letter, dated just 6 months before she died, that stopped me cold. It read, "Alex, I'm sorry, but I can't do this anymore. I've tried to help you, but you keep asking for more. Please don't contact me again." Why would Grandma cut him off like that? I started digging. I searched Alex's name online, but nothing came up. No records, no social media, nothing. It was like he didn't exist before he showed up at Thanksgiving. Then, one day, Sarah called me, panicked. "Alex just showed up at my apartment," she said. "He said he wanted to talk about Grandma, but then he started asking me about my job and my finances." It was weird. I decided to confront him. At our next family gathering, I pulled Alex aside. "Why are you really here?" I demanded. He smiled that same too wide smile. "I'm here to reconnect with my family." "Isn't that what Grandma would have wanted?" "Cut the crap," I said. "What did you do to her? Why did she stop talking to you?" His smile faltered, just for a second. Then he leaned in close. "Be careful what you dig up, kid. You might not like what you find." That night, I couldn't sleep. I went back to Grandma's box and found an old photo of Alex as a teenager. On the back, in Grandma's handwriting, were the words, "His father was dangerous. So is he." The next morning, I called Uncle Joe and told him everything. He didn't seem surprised. "There's something you don't know," Joe said. "When I was a kid, there was this man who used to show up at the house. Grandma said he was a friend of hers, but he scared the hell out of me. One day, he just stopped coming around. I think it was Alex's father." I pieced it together. Grandma must have given Alex up not just because she was young and unmarried, but because his father was dangerous. And now Alex was here, trying to worm his way into our family. Determined to get answers, I broke into Alex's Airbnb while he was out. His laptop was open, and what I found made my blood run cold. He had a folder labeled Targets. Inside were files on every member of our family, addresses, birthdays, bank account details. And there was a note that simply read, "Phase 2 starts soon." Suddenly, I heard the front door creak open. Alex was home. I slammed the laptop shut and hid behind the couch. My heart was pounding so loud, I was sure he could hear it. "Who's been in here?" Alex muttered to himself. I held my breath as his footsteps got closer. And then, his phone rang. "Yeah, it's me," he said. "No, they don't suspect a thing. But we need to move faster. The family's starting to ask questions." My blood turned to ice. Who was he talking to? I stayed crouched behind the couch, heart hammering in my chest. Alex's voice was low but sharp, every word twisting like a knife in my gut. "No, not yet. They're still too scattered," he continued. But the money's there. Once we have access to the accounts, we can disappear. Access to the accounts? Disappear? What was this guy planning? The conversation ended, and I heard Alex pacing the room. My legs were cramping, and I knew I couldn't stay hidden forever. My phone vibrated in my pocket, and I nearly jumped. Whoever was calling me now had the worst timing in the world. Alex froze. Who's there? My heart raced as I weighed my options. Run for the door? Stay hidden and pray he left the room? But before I could decide, Alex's eyes landed on the laptop. He noticed the screen wasn't how he left it. Someone's been here, he muttered, and then his gaze swept the room. I stood up, trying to look calm, though I was anything but. What the hell is this, Alex? I asked, motioning toward the laptop. His expression darkened. For the first time, the fake charm was gone. You shouldn't have done that, he said. You're planning something, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. You're not here to reconnect. You're here to scam us, or worse. Alex took a step toward me, and instinctively, I backed up. You don't know what you're talking about, he said, his voice low and menacing. This family owes me. I'm just taking what's mine. Owes you? I shot back. Grandma gave you up because your father was a psycho. Maybe she should have done the same with you. That struck a nerve. Alex's face twisted with rage, and he lunged at me. I barely dodged him, grabbing a nearby lamp and swinging it. It shattered against his arm, and he cried out in pain. I didn't wait to see what he'd do next. I bolted for the door. My shaking hands fumbled with the lock, but I managed to get out, sprinting down the street. My car was parked a block away, and I prayed Alex wouldn't chase me. When I glanced back, he was standing in the doorway, watching me with an eerie calm. This isn't over, he shouted after me. Back home, I called an emergency family meeting. Aunt Linda, Uncle Joe, my sister Sarah, and Mom gathered in Mom's living room, all of them confused and concerned. You broke into his place? Mom asked, horrified. You're missing the point, I said, frustrated. Alex has files on all of us. He's been planning something, probably to steal from us. He's not who he says he is. Uncle Joe looked grim. I knew there was something off about him, but Mom shook her head. He's family. He's been through so much. Maybe you're just misinterpreting? Mom, stop. I interrupted. This guy has nothing but bad intentions. He's dangerous. Grandma knew it, and now we do too. Before Mom could respond, Sarah chimed in. He showed up at my apartment uninvited, asking weird questions about my job. That's not normal. Uncle Joe nodded. And now this, it's starting to add up. I think we need to cut him off, immediately. As we debated what to do, there was a knock at the door. My stomach dropped. Don't answer it, I said. But Mom, still clinging to her belief that Alex was misunderstood, opened the door. It wasn't Alex. It was a police officer. Ma'am, the officer said, tipping his hat, we're looking for Alexander Gray. We've received reports of identity theft and financial fraud. Do you know where he is? The room fell silent. Mom turned pale. He's my brother. What's going on? The officer hesitated, then said, Mr. Gray has been under investigation for years. He targets families, gains their trust, and drains their accounts. He's highly dangerous. See, I said, glaring at Mom. But before the officer could say more, there was a crash from the back of the house. Alex. He'd broken in. Chaos erupted. The officer drew his weapon and shouted for Alex to freeze. But Alex was fast, too fast. He darted through the kitchen and grabbed Mom, holding a knife to her throat. Everyone, stay back. Alex shouted. Alex, don't do this, Mom pleaded, tears streaming down her face. You people ruined my life. Alex screamed. This was supposed to be my chance to start over. The officer kept his gun trained on Alex, trying to de-escalate. Let her go, Alex. You don't want to do this. For a moment, it seemed like Alex might listen. His grip on Mom loosened just slightly. And then, with a chilling smile, he said, You'll never understand. There was a loud bang, the officer fired. Alex crumpled to the floor. But as we all rushed to Mom's side, the officer checked Alex's pulse and looked up, his face grim. He's gone, the officer said. I felt a mix of relief and horror. But then, from the kitchen, we heard something, a phone ringing. It was Alex's. The officer answered it, putting it on speaker. A distorted voice said, Is it done? Are they ready for phase 2? We all froze. Phase 2? The line went dead. The silence in the room was suffocating, broken only by the officer's labored breathing as he stared at the phone. Mom was still trembling, clutching her neck where Alex had held her, but her eyes were locked on the device as if it were a ticking time bomb. What is phase 2? Sarah asked, her voice barely a whisper. The officer didn't answer. Instead, he flipped the phone over, fiddling with it until he found what he was looking for, a list of recent messages. His face darkened. "I need backup," he muttered into his radio. "What's going on?" I demanded, stepping closer. The officer hesitated. "Alex wasn't working alone," he finally said. "It looks like he was part of a larger operation. From these messages, it seems like someone else was coordinating with him. They've been targeting families like yours for years." Aunt Linda gasped. "Families like ours? What does that even mean?" The officer scrolled through Alex's phone, his expression grim. "We need to get you all out of here. Now." "Out of here? Why?" Uncle Joe asked, his voice tinged with panic. The officer looked up. "Because whoever Alex was working with, they know where you live." Within an hour, we were packed and rushed into police SUVs, heading to a secure location. The officer wouldn't give us details, only that they were taking precautions until the investigation was complete. As we drove, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. Alex's death should have been the end of it, but something about the way he'd smiled before the officer fired, the way he'd said "you'll never understand," lingered in my mind. Mom, sitting next to me, finally broke the silence. Do you think Alex was telling the truth? That we owed him something?" I looked at her, stunned. "Mom, he was trying to kill you." "I know," she whispered, staring out the window. "But what if we're missing something? What if this goes deeper than we thought?" The police took us to a nondescript house on the outskirts of town. It was a sterile, lonely place, with locked windows and a single exit. They told us not to leave under any circumstances. As the night dragged on, tension filled the air. Sarah was pacing, Aunt Linda was crying, and Uncle Joe kept muttering about how none of this made sense. I sat at the kitchen table, staring at Alex's phone, which the officer had left behind. It had a passcode, but something told me there was more on it, something the police hadn't found yet. Suddenly, Sarah stopped pacing. "Did anyone tell Grandma's lawyer about Alex?" she asked. We all turned to her. "What lawyer?" I asked. "The one who handled Grandma's estate," Sarah said. "What if Alex knew about the will? What if this whole thing started because of that?" The next morning, I convinced the officer guarding the house to let me call the lawyer. It took some persuasion, but eventually, I got through to him. "Mr. Jacobs," I said, "did my grandmother ever mention anything about Alex in her estate plans?" There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Who told you about Alex?" Jacobs finally asked. "What do you mean?" I said. "He's been in our lives for months." Jacobs sighed. "Your grandmother came to me about a year before she passed. She was paranoid, said someone was blackmailing her. She didn't give me details, but she mentioned the name Alex and told me to secure her assets in case something happened." My blood ran cold. "Blackmailing her how?" "She didn't say," Jacobs admitted. "But she was scared. She wanted to make sure her will was airtight, so no one outside the family could touch it. I thought it was odd at the time, but now..." "What?" I pressed. "Now I think she knew something was coming," Jacobs said. "Something bigger than just Alex." That night, as the family slept, I sat in the darkened kitchen, staring at Alex's phone. I didn't know the passcode, but Grandma's box of letters had given me an idea. I typed in the date from her final letter to Alex, the one where she cut him off. The phone unlocked. My stomach churned as I opened his messages. Most were mundane, updates on his movements and plans. But one thread caught my eye. It was from an unknown number, the same one that had called after Alex's death. The most recent message read, "He's dead. What now?" And the reply sent just hours ago chilled me to the core. "Stick to the plan. They're still valuable. Phase 2 proceeds as scheduled." My hands were trembling as I scrolled up, reading the earlier messages. They detailed every move Alex had made, from showing up at Thanksgiving to ingratiating himself with the family. But one message stood out. "Do they know about the inheritance yet?" The inheritance? Grandma's will? None of us had even seen it. Mom was supposed to handle it after the holidays. A sudden realization hit me. Whoever Alex was working with didn't just want our trust or our accounts. They wanted control over everything Grandma had left behind. Before I could piece it all together, the house's power went out. The hum of the refrigerator stopped, the lights blinked off, and the air was filled with an eerie silence. Then, from outside, came the sound of tires on gravel. I grabbed the phone and ran to the window, peeking out. A black van was parked at the edge of the property, its engine idling. My phone buzzed. A text appeared on Alex's phone, from the unknown number. "We're here." The front door handle rattled. The rattling at the door turned into pounding. My heart thundered in my chest as I backed away, clutching Alex's phone like a lifeline. The rest of the family stirred, their confused voices drifting down the hallway. "Stay in your rooms," I hissed, trying to keep the panic from my voice. The pounding stopped, replaced by a chilling silence. Then, with a deafening crash, the door splintered open. Two figures in black masks stormed inside, each carrying something far worse than weapons: purpose. They weren't here to rob us. They weren't even here for revenge. They were here to finish something. The family rushed out of their rooms, eyes wide with terror. Mom froze when she saw the intruders. "What is this?" she screamed. "Go!" I yelled, grabbing her arm and pushing her toward the back door. Sarah was already pulling Aunt Linda, who was too stunned to move. Uncle Joe grabbed a heavy candlestick from the mantel, his face set with grim determination. "Go," he said firmly, stepping toward the intruders. "Joe, no," Aunt Linda wailed. But there was no time to argue. The rest of us stumbled out the back door into the freezing night. The black van was still parked at the edge of the property, its headlights cutting through the darkness like ominous eyes. "This way," I shouted, leading them toward the woods that bordered the property. Behind us, there was shouting and the unmistakable sound of a struggle. Uncle Joe was buying us time. We stumbled through the woods, the cold biting at our skin. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. Alex's phone buzzed again in my hand. Another message. "Don't let them reach the safe house." My blood froze. They knew where we were going. We burst out of the woods into a clearing, only to see two more figures blocking our path. One of them held a flashlight, its beam landing directly on us. "There they are," one of them said, their voice muffled by their mask. Mom screamed, and Aunt Linda collapsed into Sarah's arms, sobbing. I turned to run, but before I could move, the second figure pulled out a gun. "Don't even think about it," he said. They herded us back toward the house. My mind was racing, but I couldn't see a way out. If they knew where the safe house was, it meant this whole thing, our escape, the police intervention, had been a trap. As we got closer to the house, I noticed something strange. The black van was still idling, but the back doors were wide open, and the officer who had been guarding us was lying face down on the ground. They'd already taken him out. We were shoved back into the house, where Uncle Joe was slumped against the wall, his face bloodied but alive. One of the masked figures leaned down, checking his pulse. "He's fine," the man grunted. The second figure was rummaging through the kitchen drawers, looking for something. "Where's the will?" he barked, his voice sharp and demanding. "What will?" Mom stammered, tears streaming down her face. "Don't play dumb," the man snapped. "We know it's here. You think you can just cut us out? After everything?" That's when it clicked. Their family too. The realization hit like a punch to the gut. Whoever these people were, they knew too much. They weren't just criminals, they were part of this mess, tied to Alex and, somehow, to us. But before I could say anything, the front door creaked open. Everyone froze. Another figure stepped inside, tall and imposing. He wasn't wearing a mask, and his face was eerily familiar. It was the man from the old photo in Grandma's box, the one Uncle Joe had described as scary. "Enough," he said, his voice calm but commanding. "You're making a mess of things." The masked men immediately stepped back, deferring to him. "Who are you?" I demanded, my voice shaking. He smiled, a cold, cruel smile. "You can call me Richard. But to your grandmother, I was something much more important." Richard stepped closer, his gaze sweeping over us like a predator assessing prey. "Your grandmother owed me," he said. "She thought she could run, start over, bury her secrets. But debts don't just disappear." "What debts?" I spat. Richard chuckled. "Oh, you don't know, do you? She didn't tell you what she did to keep your perfect little family intact? No one owes you anything." Uncle Joe growled, struggling to his feet. Richard ignored him. "She made a deal," he said, looking straight at Mom. "A long time ago, when things were complicated. And when she couldn't pay up, she gave me something instead." "Alex," I whispered, the pieces clicking into place. Richard grinned. "Smart kid." "Yes, Alex. But she didn't just give him away, she gave him to me. To erase her debt." The room spun. Grandma hadn't just given Alex up for adoption, she'd handed him over to someone dangerous. Richard's expression darkened. But Alex wasn't enough. She promised more, everything she had when the time was right. And now she's gone, which means the debt falls to you. "We don't owe you anything," Sarah shouted. Richard tilted his head, amused. "You don't get it, do you? This isn't just about money. This is about legacy. And your family's legacy belongs to me now." Before anyone could respond, there was a loud knock at the back door. Richard frowned, motioning for the masked men to check it out. But as they approached, the door exploded inward, and a SWAT team stormed in, shouting orders. The room erupted into chaos. In the confusion, Richard grabbed Alex's phone from my hand, locking eyes with me one last time. "This isn't over," he said, his voice low and chilling. And then, just like that, he disappeared into the night. We thought it was over. Until, 2 weeks later, I received a package in the mail. Inside was a single photograph of Grandma as a young woman, standing next to Richard. On the back, scrawled in her handwriting, were the words, "It always comes back to family." The photo stayed in my hand, its edges worn and fragile, like the secret it carried. I stared at Grandma's cryptic note scrawled on the back. "It always comes back to family. What does this even mean?" Sarah asked, standing over my shoulder. I didn't answer. I couldn't. The image of Richard, younger but just as imposing, standing next to my grandmother, smiling, was burned into my mind. How deep did this go? How long had this shadow loomed over us without us even knowing? Beneath the photograph, folded neatly, was a letter. I unfolded it slowly, my hands trembling. The handwriting wasn't Grandma's. It read, "To the next generation. I hope you're smarter than your grandmother. She tried to cheat me, and she failed. She thought she could erase her mistakes, but family is never erased. It's inherited. One day, you'll come to understand what your legacy truly is. Until then, I'll be watching. R." The room fell silent as I read it aloud. "Who is this guy?" Sarah whispered. "More like, what is he?" Uncle Joe muttered darkly. The police had been investigating Richard and his network since the night of the attack, but progress was slow. The SWAT team's raid had only scattered his operation, they hadn't caught him. Alex's death left a trail of encrypted files and half-finished plans, none of which the authorities could crack. But the package made one thing clear, Richard wasn't done with us. "We need to get ahead of this," I said, pacing the room. "If we wait for him to make his next move, it'll be too late." "How?" Mom asked, her voice shaky. "We don't even know what he wants." "Legacy," I said, holding up the photo. "Whatever that means, it's tied to Grandma." Aunt Linda wiped her eyes. "Grandma always talked about how she left her past behind when she married Grandpa. She never told us what she meant by that. What if she was running from Richard all along?" Digging through Grandma's belongings felt invasive, but we had no choice. Mom, Sarah, and I spent hours combing through old photo albums, journals, and documents. Finally, hidden in the lining of an old sewing box, we found a small key. Taped to it was a yellowed note. "For when the past catches up." My pulse quickened. "This has to be it. Where does it go?" Sarah asked. Mom's face paled. "Grandma had a safety deposit box. She mentioned it once, years ago, but I thought it was just for jewelry or keepsakes." The next morning, we went to the bank. It took some convincing, but after verifying Grandma's death certificate and our IDs, the manager led us to a private room. Inside the deposit box was a single envelope, sealed and labeled for my family. Mom opened it with trembling hands. Inside were two things, a handwritten letter and an old, crumpled contract. The contract was horrifying. Grandma had signed it decades ago, pledging a substantial portion of her future estate to Richard in exchange for what the document called protection. The terms were vague, but one thing was clear, if Grandma defaulted, the debt would pass to her descendants. "That's why he's after us," Sarah said, her voice shaking. "She couldn't pay him back, and now it's on us." The letter was more personal. "My dearest family. I'm sorry. I thought I could protect you, but I was wrong. Richard isn't just a man, he's a force, a curse. He knows things, and he uses them to manipulate and control. I made a mistake trusting him, and now I fear you'll pay the price. If you're reading this, he's already found you. The only way to end this is to find the ledger. It's the only record of everything he's done. Without it, he's untouchable." I hit it where it all began. "Where it all began?" I asked. "What does that mean?" Mom's eyes filled with tears. "Grandma grew up in a farmhouse, just outside of town. She always said it was the place where her life changed forever." "That has to be it," I said. Uncle Joe looked grim. "If Richard knows about this, he'll be watching it too." "Then we need to move fast," I said. The house was abandoned, its windows boarded up and its yard overgrown. It looked like no one had stepped foot there in years. "Are we sure about this?" Sarah asked, glancing around nervously. "We don't have a choice," I said. Inside, the air was thick with dust and decay. We searched every room, every creaking floorboard, looking for any sign of a hidden ledger. Finally, in the attic, we found it, a small wooden box tucked behind a pile of old furniture. Inside was a leather-bound book, its pages filled with meticulous records of names, dates, and transactions. This was it. Before we could celebrate, the sound of footsteps echoed from downstairs. "They're here," Uncle Joe whispered. We barely had time to react before Richard's men stormed the attic. Richard himself followed, his cold smile sending chills down my spine. "You've been busy," he said, his eyes falling on the ledger. "Hand it over?" "No," I said, clutching the book to my chest. Richard sighed, pulling a gun from his coat. "You don't understand what you're dealing with. This isn't just about your family, it's about power. That ledger is worth more than you can imagine, and I won't let you keep it." Mom stepped forward, her voice trembling. You've already taken so much from us. Just let us go. Richard's smile faded. I don't let anyone go. Suddenly, the floor beneath us groaned. The old attic beams, weakened by years of neglect, began to give way. Richard's men froze, looking around nervously. Everyone out, now! Richard shouted, but it was too late. With a deafening crack, the floor collapsed, sending us plummeting into the darkness below. I hit the ground hard, the ledger still clutched in my hand. When I looked up, Richard was standing over me, his gun aimed directly at my head. This ends here, he said. And then, from somewhere in the shadows, came the sound of a voice. No, it doesn't. A figure stepped into the light, someone I never expected to see again. Alex. Alive. The sight of Alex standing there, alive and unscathed, made my mind whirl. He was supposed to be dead, shot by the officer right in front of us. Yet here he was, his face a mixture of defiance and triumph. You! Richard growled, his gun wavering for the first time. You were supposed to be finished? Alex smirked. You really thought I'd let you take everything, didn't you? I'm not your pawn anymore, Richard. What's going on? Sarah whispered, clutching Mom's arm. I didn't have an answer, but one thing was clear, Alex wasn't on Richard's side anymore. Hand over the ledger, Richard ordered, his calm demeanor unraveling. Alex stepped forward, unarmed but utterly confident. You've been using me my entire life, Richard. I was your insurance policy, your foot in the door with this family. But you made one mistake. Richard sneered. And what's that? You underestimated me. Before Richard could respond, Alex lunged at him, knocking the gun from his hand. It skidded across the floor as chaos erupted. Richard's men surged forward, but Uncle Joe tackled one, and I swung the wooden box at another. Alex and Richard grappled, their shouts filling the air as the attic's fragile remains groaned ominously. Get the ledger out of here. Alex shouted. I hesitated for a moment, torn between helping and running, but Mom grabbed my arm. He's right, go. Clutching the ledger, I scrambled out of the farmhouse with Sarah and Mom close behind. The sound of fighting faded as we ran into the woods, the dense trees swallowing us whole. Behind us, Richard's men gave chase. Their shouts grew louder as they closed the distance. This way! I yelled, veering toward a narrow stream. The cold water bit at my ankles as we splashed through, hoping to lose our pursuers. Suddenly, a hand grabbed my shoulder, yanking me back. I turned, swinging the ledger like a weapon, and caught one of Richard's men square in the jaw. He crumpled, but more were coming. We can't outrun them. Sarah cried. We don't have to, I said, spotting a fallen log near the stream bank. Help me hide this. Together, we shoved the ledger into a hollow beneath the log, covering it with leaves and mud. They'll never find it here, I said, breathless. Mom and Sarah didn't have time to argue. The men caught up to us moments later, dragging us back toward the farmhouse. My heart pounded, terrified they'd search us and realize the ledger was gone. When we were shoved back inside, Richard was waiting, his face bloodied but victorious. Alex lay on the ground, barely conscious, but alive. Where's the ledger? Richard demanded, pacing like a caged animal. I burned it, I lied, trying to keep my voice steady. Richard froze, his eyes narrowing. You're lying. I shrugged. Believe what you want. But if it's gone, so is your power. His fury was palpable. He raised his hand, but Alex's voice cut through the tension. You're done, Richard, Alex rasped, struggling to sit up. Even if you kill us, the ledger will find its way to the authorities. It's over. For the first time, Richard looked uncertain. Before Richard could respond, the farmhouse groaned again. The earlier collapse had destabilized the entire structure, and now the walls and ceiling began to crumble. Get out, someone screamed, but it was too late. The roof gave way, and the room was plunged into chaos. I grabbed Sarah and Mom, dragging them toward the nearest exit as debris rained down around us. Through the haze of dust, I saw Alex struggling to pull himself up. Alex! I shouted, but he waved me off. Go, he yelled. I'll handle this. I hesitated, but Mom tugged my arm. We have to leave. With a heavy heart, I turned and ran. We stumbled out into the night, coughing and bleeding but alive. Behind us, the farmhouse collapsed completely, sending a plume of smoke and dust into the air. Police sirens wailed in the distance, but when they arrived, there was no sign of Richard or Alex. They were both gone. Days later, I returned to the stream. The ledger was still there, untouched. I handed it over to the authorities, who promised to use it to dismantle Richard's network. But questions lingered. Where was Alex? Had he survived the collapse? And if so, was he truly on our side, or was this just another one of his games? Weeks turned into months, and life slowly returned to normal.